very good evening to you. I am Lisa Lord, and my special guest is the Minister of Energy and Business Development, Senator the Honorable Lisa Cummins. Minister, thank you so much for joining us on the program again.
Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome. No, you're wearing a different hat than when we last chatted.
Yeah.
You were the Minister of Tourism and International Transport at that time.
Right.
Now you have a very expansive ministry, which also includes international business and trade. However, I want to start with energy, which essentially would need a program of its own, but we'll try to get through as much as we can.
Yeah.
Now, government has set a very ambitious target according to the Barbados National Energy Policy 2019 to 2030, which is to achieve the 100% renewable energy and carbon neutral transformational goals by 2030. This is 2023. How realistic is this target given that we only have 7 years remaining?
So it's an ambitious target. Yeah. In 2019, when Barbados developed the national energy policy, the world was very different pre-COVID. So there were no supply chain issues, there were no procurement challenges, and as a consequence, we didn't have a number of the issues that we're navigating now. Post-COVID, the world came to a halt and supply chains were interrupted. You had great difficulties procuring battery supplies, and so batteries, the wait time for batteries became exponential. So whereas you may have been waiting before COVID for 6 months possibly for the fabrication, now you're waiting 18 to 24 months in principle post-COVID. Mercifully, that time frame has come down now, and we still are seeing somewhere between a year to 6 to 8 months maximum wait time is a year, but it is still an extended period of time. So those things have an impact on our ability to meet the targets that we have set for ourselves. But are we to throw our hands up in the air? Absolutely not. We've set an ambitious target, and we're putting every single measure in place to ensure that we reach that target. And so what are we doing? Despite the challenges in the supply chain with things like batteries for storage, despite the challenges in things like transformers and inverters, which are also being affected by supply chain challenges, we are still pushing forward. So we reached out for help because we can't do everything ourselves. And so we reached out to the UN. And the UN, through the UN Special Envoy for Energy, representing an entity called Sustainable Energy for All, SE for All, based out of Vienna, Austria, they came down here, sat with our team, and in March, we then started the process of reviewing the Barbados Energy Plan as at 2019 to see where we were, to do a full stock take in the first instance, and then see what was needed on an accelerated timeline between 2023 and 2030 to help us to reach those targets, notwithstanding the kinds of challenges that I have identified are in existence up until this point now. So we're navigating what that looks like, and we expect that within the next 3 months or so, we should have in hand an updated energy strategy that tells us where we need to go. We should have within another 4 to 5 months or so an updated integrated resilience and recovery plan that also was at 2021. So we're putting the measures in place that help us not just to meet the targets, but to identify the level of financing and capitalization of different kinds that will be necessary to meet those targets for 2030.
Driving around Barbados, more and more households and businesses are utilizing photovoltaic systems, and I know the government has provided several incentives to encourage persons to move in this direction.
Yeah, that's actually a big deal. And interestingly, earlier this year, and sometimes we take for granted what we have at home, and sometimes we see all of the things that are not right or things that are problematic, and we don't always see the things that are really good about Barbados and who we are as a people. We got an award in May of this year in Miami. I accepted the award on behalf of Barbados for our house owners program for energy. And the notion that Barbados, this country who is moving towards a renewable energy transition goal for 2030, has made a determination that, all right, we have X amount of space on our grid that can accommodate renewable energy being onboarded. But we don't want only the big players to be able to take up all of that space with large investment scale projects. We want ordinary Barbadians to be able to have access to the renewable energy transition opportunities that are being presented. We want ordinary Barbadians to be able to use the roofs of the houses that they own to be able to be a part of the energy transition. It's not just about earning an income, because that's the enfranchisement part of it, but it's about changing lifestyles and changing mindsets and being a part of the climate crisis solution that is being coalesced around Barbados by Prime Minister's leadership. So you've seen that happening. So you have large investor scale projects, and you typically will see that coming 1 megawatt over 10 and up to 10 megawatts and over 10 megawatts. But you have house projects which are under a megawatt typically, and Barbadians have responded in a way that has been overwhelming. So people are intrigued by what Barbados has been able to accomplish, not just in terms of our goals, not just in terms of the targets that we have set, by the level of inclusion that has taken place and the level of enfranchisement that has taken place. So yes, there has been a significant uptake among Barbadians for rooftop solar systems, and among investors, both for commercial grade rooftop systems of a certain size as well as solar farms. You're seeing a lot of 1 megawatt solar farms going up, and you're seeing a lot more integration into manufacturing as well. And that is very much a part of the process. And we're very happy to see that. So we're proud of that. That has been something that countries are coming to me and saying, or to me or to the ministry, to say, tell us a little bit about what Barbados is doing. Tell us how Barbados did this for householders. We want to be able to do all of that as well. But that's not to say it's without challenges. And let's be frank, the grid is only so large. The response from Barbadians, ordinary Barbadians and homeowners and commercial investors alike has been so significant that we now have to be able to invest in grid modernization and grid expansion, and that really has to be the work of the government in partnership with the utility. It is an absolute critical priority for us to be able to move in the direction of that modernization of the grid, democratization of access even further, but also to integrate storage into the grid for the purpose of, in the first instance, ensuring stability, because you have intermittent sources of power coming onto the grid. And so, that needs to be stabilized. Battery storage comes into that conversation as well. And then, of course, the banking system. Prime Minister in November last year established a number of committees, one of which I chair jointly with the Barbados Bankers Association, because you have to make sense of the process in terms of being able to access financing. So you have a lot of householders who have gone to commercial banks and have used their roofs to be able to get roof-mounted systems. And so we've been having those conversations with the bank, and we've had to be talking about unlocking the further investment capital that needs to be unlocked once we're able to get past the route of grid modernization. So it is a complex thing. And I'm really happy that so far we have been able to take a stakeholder-based approach to how we go about resolving challenges that are before us. So one, we have the committee, which I chair alongside the Barbados Bankers Association. We have expanded those committees even further. So we have the large committee, and then underneath it we have several subcommittees, which are chaired by government and industry jointly, to look at issues relating to power purchase agreements, to look at the diversification of the energy mix, including specifically wind. So we have a wind subcommittee, and we're working through those, and we're now looking at how to work on educating the public on what is happening in the energy sector. So there's quite a bit of work happening, and there are a ton of players that are already at the table and will continue to come to the table to be a part of that conversation.
Now, I know that you touched on it just now in terms of speaking about the modernization of the grid. Mm-hmm. However, in your discussions with the Barbados Light and Power Company Limited, how are they handling this demand for renewable energy?
It's a significant demand. So you have people who are investing in a solar mounted system and a roof mounted system, for example, for PV. They want to be able to come onto the grid so that they can get a return on their investment on a monthly basis to either service the debt for putting that on the system, or if the debt has already been paid off, that it helps to supplement their household income. That's important. And then you have the commercial grade investors who are also there. But you have the utility on the other hand, and you've heard Prime Minister speaking about this on more than one occasion. It is absolutely critical, certainly for the government, that we're able to work hand in hand with both the Barbados Light and Power and the regulator, namely the Fair Trading Commission, to bring us to a stage where we're able to control, on the one hand, the price to the consumer, where we're not onboarding measures in the system where either at the level of the rates, either at the level of putting storage in the system. Because let me break this down for you a little bit here. Let me just try and put it in a way that possibly can make sense. If I have a a project, if I go to the bank and I say I want to put solar PV panels on my roof, and I want to be able to put a 1 megawatt system, and it costs me $10. Okay, I'm going to the bank for $10. But if I can't get that onto the grid because the grid does not have the capacity to accommodate it, then I have to include storage. So that means that this change in my investment may go from $10 to $20. And so that changes what my repayment schedule is going to look like. And so my conversation with the bank is going to be entirely different because I'm now spending more, and I now need to make sure that what I spend, I'm able to get a return on to service my debt, and then ultimately that it makes sense. So those are questions which are being navigated now by independent producers of power who are trying to get onto the grid. On the other hand, you have the regulator who is trying to make sure that through feed-in tariffs and adjustment clauses, notwithstanding the fact that fossil fuel has to still be imported, and we are still importing fossil fuel, heavy fuel oil in particular, to service the needs of the generating plant for the light and power, that they still have to be able to account for the fluctuating global price of energy products. So you've put that, so you have A, which is what's happening on the one hand, B, which is happening on the other hand, and then all of a sudden you have to deal with the consumer. All of those costs come through to the consumer, can come through to the consumer. That's where the regulator comes in. And so the regulator is trying to ensure that the investor is able to get a return on their investment. Light and Power is able to get a return on their investment because they have spent the money up front, and that they're accounting for the adjustment that is coming as a result of fuel, and that simultaneously all of those things combined do not negatively impact the cost of power in the country. How that becomes even more important, certainly from the Ministry of Business side, because I have to consider it on the business side. If energy is expensive to the commercial sector, to the productive sector, to the manufacturing sector, to the agricultural sector, to the fishery sector, then there's a pass on to the consumers. So we have to be able to make sure that there's a holistic approach. And really, sometimes it's very difficult when the Fair Trading Commission has had to delay issuing reports and their conclusions and so on. But I gave you all of that just to put into context just how complex a mix they're trying to navigate, because ultimately they have a consumer protection role on the one hand, while still not trying to be a disincentive to investment. So those are some of the things that are really being navigated, and we're committed to making sure that within the shortest possible time frame, we find the solutions.
And as Barbadians try to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels, more Barbadians are purchasing
Absolutely.
hybrid and
Electric cars,
vehicles.
yeah.
What is the demand like for those vehicles?
Well, what I will tell you is that there's one particular car dealership that had the leadership of one of the car manufacturing companies, and you guys were here when Nissan came down, because you had one entity globally that is seeing what's happening in every market around the world, and then you have a country that is Barbados that is on the lips of everyone globally about the issues of climate crisis and our prime minister. But you simultaneously had the market doing interesting things. The demand for electric cars and hybrid cars in Barbados was so significant that it caught the attention of the manufacturers at Nissan, and they thought, we need to really understand what's happening with this particular country, because the demand in Barbados is almost outstripping some of the other markets that they would have expected to be performing better. So they came down. And so the expectation is that more and more Barbadians will make that conversion to hybrids or to electric cars. And certainly, last year, the government would have put a number of incentives in place to incentivize persons to make that transition. And this year, they were further expanded, and you widened the net as well to include nurses, and, have the scooters and so on for postmen and stuff like that now being incorporated. So there are incentives which are in place. But let's part that and then come to the fact that we have about 120 to 150,000 cars existing on the road. So the question is, what do you do in order to make this transition? I don't think anyone expects that everybody is going to be able to afford either an electric car or a hybrid car, no matter how many incentives are in place. I know certainly for me, my car is not new. It's not new. I've had my car since, I want to say 2017, something like that. And I don't know how I would justify changing it, because, there's a certain amount of freedom sometimes when you've paid for your car and you don't owe anybody
said
for
it.
it, right?
You
There's
said
a
it.
certain amount of freedom, you accept that. And so I know that I'm not the only Barbadian who
That
thinks
feels like
in that
that.
way,
Yep.
don't want a new car. But at the same time, again, going back to that question of a lifestyle change and a mindset change, as opposed to just on the return on investment and being part of the climate crisis solutions that Barbados is known for, should we be driving an electric car? Should we at least make the transition initially to a hybrid? And what do we do with the existing fleet of cars that we have on the road? And that transportation transition is critical. So you have CNG, for example. There are some countries that are now looking at CNG solutions and using existing fossil fuel cars and transitioning them. And you have biogas solutions, which are now coming on board. There's actually an interesting new project being done with sargassum seaweed, rum, through the University of the West Indies, which is a really great innovation. And they're moving in the direction of treating with sargassum, collecting the sargassum offshore, and then working with the researchers at the University of the West Indies to produce biogas to fuel transportation. So you have electricity on the one hand, hybrids on the other hand, which do take gas and electricity, and you also have the biogas solutions which are being proposed to allow for the existing fleet to also transition without people taking on the new obligations of debt for a brand new car, even with incentives.
So since you and I are still driving gasoline cars,
Yeah.
in the interim, there's always the concern about these rising oil prices. Let's look at the buffers to protect or try to shield Barbadians from these constant external shocks from rising oil prices.
Lisa, I wish I could tell you that there was a mechanism to shield in its entirety. You know, we're not part of OPEC, and we are very vulnerable. When you hear it when you hear people say it all the time, the reality of it is that it means something when you start to put it into scenarios like oil prices. When we say we are vulnerable to external shocks, or as the economists would say, exogenous shocks, this is what we're talking about. So when you have the Saudi Arabian oil producing nation deciding to cut oil production by a certain percentage, that has a run-on effect. In order to maintain pricing, then you have them hovering around a certain price, but that has an impact on a country like Barbados, which is importing all of its fuel products. So the efforts to contain prices in Barbados are multifaceted, multi-layered. You would have seen the government have the second prices compact earlier this year, which sought to minimize the markups for prices that were goods that were commonly used by Barbadians. So you don't necessarily think oil and fuel products and prices compact, but the two are linked, right? So they're linked not just because fuel prices have gone up, but as a consequence of fuel prices going up, you also have shipping prices going up. And certainly we saw during the period 2020 through 2023, from the Far East, shipping prices increased by around 500%. From Eastern Europe, they increased about 300%. In the US, more nearshore, they increased also between 300 to 500%, all as a consequence of COVID lockdowns, inadequate labor supplies, and absolutely, yes, increasing and fluctuating oil prices. So those things then had an impact on Barbados's imports because we still are a net importing country. So how do we manage that? We had to cap the markup. But the first costs are without our control, are outside of our control. So what if an importer pays at the point of sale, where they purchase, I should say, what an importer pays, if for example, one supermarket is buying from a distributor and that distributor is in China, if the price is $10 now, and that price because of fluctuating oil prices goes up, it's $15 tomorrow. They're still paying $15. What we are capping is the percentage of markup between 12 to 15%, so that it does not go any higher than that. But there still may be an increase in price ultimately because the original price being paid when they buy it in the first place is higher. And those are some of the things that we're navigating to try to keep prices contained. Then you have the cap on the VAT for residential customers for electricity. That has been put in place to address that. The incentives that are in place to obviously make the transition for electric cars, those are there as well, so that people are reducing the amount of electricity and the amount of fuel products that they use, whether it is gasoline or diesel. All of those are things that government has put in place to try to contain costs to Barbadians. But there has to be more, quite frankly. There has to be a whole lot more. And so from the business side of my ministry, because the two things have to be done hand in hand, have to be treated to hand in hand, we're looking at a range of measures that need to be implemented over time. And of course, have the Smart Energy Program, which is winding down. That has done quite a bit of work, in particular with Fund Access, and even a Transportation Augmentation Program that was executed under Fund Access to be able to bring more and more persons into enfranchisement by creating more opportunities for earning. So there has to be the opportunity for people to earn on the one hand by creating business opportunities while managing pricing on the other hand. So it's a complex but an important mix that we have to get right.
Earlier, we spoke about the demand on the BLMP.
Yeah.
Now, in February, you spoke about plans for a new Electricity Supply Act to be introduced this year. How soon can we expect this legislation to go before Cabinet?
Well, the legislation has already gone before Cabinet in its draft form, and it is presently now being tidied up by our legal teams. And once it is tidied up by the legal teams and completed for legislative drafting, it will go out to a period of national consultation, allowing people to feed into what the act ultimately needs to look like in its draft form. Right now it's a draft bill. And so by September of this year, we need to be able to have that legislation. That is a projection that we will have that legislation completed with national consultation. Once the national consultation is done, it goes back to the legislative drafters for finalization. Then Cabinet will approve that final version, and then off to Parliament it will go. And we hope to have that all done between now, June, and September. Not a lot of time.
Can you speak to some of the key elements of that legislation?
So if you were to go back to the telecoms period in the 1990s, where you had a single service provider operating under monopolistic conditions, and then you had other entrants into the market, then you had to make substantial changes to what the telecoms legislation looked like in order to change the telecoms environment. Electricity is in that identical space right now. And this Electricity Supply Act is the first comprehensive piece of legislation that will be coming to the fore since that time. And so that's what you're going to be seeing, a complete transformation in the way in which we approach the supply of electricity. And the best way to describe it would have been when we would have gone through that with telecoms back in the 1990s. That's the easiest way to describe it. I think everybody remembers the days of Bartel.
Of course.
Everybody remembers the transition thereafter. Everybody remembers those early battles when entrants were coming into the market. And so we're here now with electricity, and we're navigating the same issues in a slightly different way. But the legislation is going to be coming to regulate all of that.
Minister, I feel as though we've hardly scratched the surface with regards to the energy sector. Still a lot more to discuss. Stay with us. You're watching One on One. As Barbadians prepare for the Atlantic hurricane season, here is some basic information for every household. A gallon of water per day per person for consumption to cover about 2 weeks. At the very least, a 3-day supply of dry goods and canned foods. An adequate supply of prescription and non-prescription medication, along with a first aid kit. You will need to stock up on hygiene supplies like toilet paper, toothpaste, and soap. If you have a baby, you should ensure you have extra diapers and wipes, as well as any special food items. You should ensure you have flashlights, batteries, and a portable radio. At this time of year, Barbadians are advised to avoid buying excess meat, frozen foods, and other items that require refrigeration in the event that electricity is lost for an extended period of time. This would result in spoilage and a wastage of money.
All of our emotions, reactions, and behavior start with a thought. I'm Krisnan Hurdle, clinical psychologist and certified life coach. When we are confronted with a situation, The stimuli we receive from the outside is matched up to information, knowledge, and beliefs we have stored in our minds. This creates an emotion and then a behavioral response follows. The information we have stored as our memories, beliefs, attitudes, and our trauma shape our outlook on situations and our responses to situations. It is therefore necessary to detox, to renew, and to train the mind. Be careful what you put in and pay attention to what comes out. Take control of your mind and take control of your life.
Welcome back as we continue our chat with the Minister of Energy and Business Development, Senator the Honourable Lisa Cummins. Senator, the Barbados National Oil Company Limited, the Barbados National Terminal Company, and the National Petroleum Corporation all fall within your purview. I want to look specifically at the performance of the BNOCL.
So the BNOCL has a significant responsibility in the country, and many people see BNOCL, you drive up Woodbourne and you see these rigs and stuff in the yard, and you see the solar farms which are in different places. But what people don't know is that all the gasoline, all the diesel, all the heavy fuel oil, all of those items imported into the country are imported by the BNOCL. The rates are negotiated by the BNOCL. The logistics arrangements are put in place to have the product shipped into country by the BNOCL. Then they're stored at the BNOTCL, and so we have the facilities in the Bridgetown port area as well as the Oistins area, where you have, from Oistins in particular, it goes directly into the Barbados National Oil Terminal Company. And then you have a vast distribution and transmission network for the National Petroleum Corporation. That goes from MPC all the way down to the west coast, now up at the New Wyndhams in Sam Lord's Castle, up in St. Philip in the eastern part of the country. That is the MPC's network for distribution. So these particular companies then are all anchored on BNOCL's ability to procure fuel products at prices that they then can be able to make those prices competitive where possible to Barbadians on island. Oftentimes, and we talked earlier about the international oil prices fluctuating and international fuel prices fluctuating, and that is passed on through BNOCL. So it is a significant responsibility for that entity. But I think more to the point of BNOCL and BNOTCL and MPC, what does Barbados need as part of its National Energy Transition Plan for 2030? What is the future of an entity that has responsibility historically for importing predominantly fossil fuels? Is it still going to be that entity called the Barbados National Oil Company that has responsibility for fossil fuel procurement, marketing, and distribution? Or is there something that is far more expansive that is now required in a new incarnation in Barbados? And I think that's where we are now, where we are shoring up the performance of all of these entities that have quite frankly taken a pummeling as a result of the war in the Ukraine and the resultant increases in global fuel prices, and of course the fluctuations within OPEC and when they make determinations to cut production. All of those things have had a negative and oftentimes deleterious impact on entities like the BNOCL. And if it affects the BNOCL, it is absolutely going to affect the National Petroleum Corporation. And once those two entities are affected, there is a downstream impact on the wider economy. So we as a government have a responsibility to rationalize what we do in those instances, which is why our renewable energy transition is absolutely critical, where we are taking responsibility by way of solar PV, by way of biogas, by way of wind, onshore, offshore, by way also of introducing new forms like hydrogen, to be able then to transition the work of the BNOCL into far more renewable sources of energy to power the nation and to provide services to the consuming public, as opposed to what they're currently doing now.
Regarding MPC and natural gas, there is a heavy demand for natural gas. I certainly would love to have access to natural gas, and more householders feel the same way, and businesses.
I think One of the things that we did a few weeks ago, and the team in the Ministry of Energy is still working through what that actually looks like, is mapping out nationally what a natural gas expansion of the pipeline would look like. And so we're looking at where we're seeing increasing commercial activity buttressed by residential activity, so we can make a determination as to what the potential is for natural gas expansion across the country. So we have an industrial sector, for example, that is heavily diesel based. And so we want to be able now to transition and as a bridging fuel, moving the commercial sector, the industrial productive sector, away from diesel and towards natural gas. So we want to onboard more of the commercial sector. And as those talks continue with the commercial sector, then that helps to rationalize what residential areas will also at the same time be onboarded. So you're going to be seeing that rationalization taking place certainly over the coming weeks. It has already started, and we're doing the same thing, interestingly enough, for natural gas as we are doing for electricity. So as you have a number of infrastructure projects which are earmarked, and you've heard through the Office of the Prime Minister and certainly the Ministry with responsibility for infrastructure and planning, they're talking about the number of projects that are coming on board. The Wyndham project in St. Philip, for instance, that then opened up because the hotel needed natural gas to be able to service the rooms that are there. That then opened up opportunities for residential customers in the adjacent areas. You have that happening all across the country in different locations. We need to be able now to map the country's future capital works program, the public sector investment program, and the private investment program, whether in the tourism sector or otherwise, to our natural gas expansion for commercial and residential clients and for our RE needs. And we will have a full mapping ready over the course of the coming weeks, so we can then begin to plan what the investment needs to look like.
And we do know why everybody wants access to natural gas.
Absolutely.
Because it is extremely cheap, but those rates are heavily subsidized.
They're heavily subsidized by the government for sure. But I think that the question at this stage is, how do we manage the cost of production, both in the productive sectors and where in the residential clientele you want to be able to keep their costs low as well. I think there is always a public good that has to be attributed to things relating to energy. I mean, we talk about water as a public good. We talk about transportation as a public good. And energy in particular is also oftentimes to be treated as a public good. So natural gas is also a public good, especially for residential customers. But let's put that in the context of commercial customers as well. If a biscuit manufacturer has extraordinarily high energy costs and they're using diesel, it means that the items that sometimes the poorest of the poor are able to use, like biscuits and cheese and that kind of stuff, the cost of biscuits will go up if your energy cost as an input is high. So we have to make sure that we protect the country's most vulnerable. And as a consequence, when you hear me talking about natural gas provision, even to the productive sector and linking it to residential customers, that's what I'm talking about, keeping the cost to people low. If energy costs go up, every piece of bread that we eat, probably shouldn't be eating a whole lot of white bread, white flour, but every piece of bread that we eat becomes more expensive. Everything that is produced in country becomes more expensive, and it makes the cost of doing business in the country more expensive, and that impacts individual citizens. So it's an entire ecosystem that we have to manage. And so the NPC may be the entity, but they have a much broader remit in ensuring that their work onboards more and more commercial and residential customers as part of our overall cost measure intervention.
Now, the government is moving ahead with reforming state-owned enterprises. I'm going to put you on the spot because these entities fall under you. Their plans for the amalgamation of the BNOCL, the terminal, and MPC. Can you speak to those plans at this stage?
I think the time will come where we speak a little bit more about what those entities are meant to do, but suffice to say this, whether we're talking about MPC, BNOCL, or BNOTCL, but specifically those two, TCL is there, or KIPO, which also falls under the ministry, and I'm sure you're going to ask me something about KIPO at some point. These entities have been studied multiple times over. Barbados is not in short supply of reports on what to do about given entities. In the case of BNOCL, this has been work that has been ongoing for many, many years. The first report that I have seen, the most recent, I should say, report that I have seen on the restructuring of these entities dates back to 2021. And there were reports that predated that one as well. So the issue has to be now for me is looking at those reports, reviewing all of them, which I have done already, and making a determination on where we are at this moment in time as a country, and advising the cabinet on whether or not what was recommended 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or even 7 years ago is fit for purpose in today's incarnation. And that is the work that we're going through now. That applies to BNOCL and MPC in the same way that, quite frankly, it applies to CAIPO. Now, CAIPO, the earliest reports that I have seen on the restructuring and the reform of CAIPO date back to 2011. 2011, I've seen a report in 2016. And in some incarnations, many of those things have never been implemented. Certainly, most of the recommendations from 2011 and 2016 were not implemented, and the resources needed for an entity like a CAIPO were not implemented. Fast forward now to 2021, and you have an updated process coming out of the digitalization and the introduction of the digital corporate registry at CAIPO. And you're still rationalizing that you have a digital overlay to a system that at the back end still needed fundamentally to be transformed. And so we're equally doing that process now with CAIPO. What does modern Barbados need of its corporate registry? What does it mean to do business in modern Barbados in 2023? Where do we see ourselves by 2030? All right, we have an ambitious set of targets for energy that take us up to 2030. What are our targets that are equally ambitious, if not even more so, for business? That's the work of today, and that's what we're doing now. So BNOCL and the others have to be transformed. CAIPO and all of our business entities have to be transformed. We have to be far more people-centric. We have to be far more business-oriented. We have to function within the framework of a global community that is rapidly changing, and we have to be able to deliver on services to the Barbadian people. That's what we're here for.
So an amalgamation is on the cards.
We will tell you when the time comes what exactly is on the cards, but there is meant to be absolutely a rationalization of what all entities are doing. Because the key thing for reforming of state-owned enterprises, certainly the ones that I'm responsible for, is not doing it just for doing its sake. It's about ensuring that the services that they're meant to deliver, that they are actually delivering them, and that the way in which they are delivering them is cost effective, is time effective, and that it is delivering on the expectations of people.
Well, what is on the cards is the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, which is upon us.
Oh, yeah.
So
absolutely.
it has just started.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to the security of our fuel and natural gas supplies? Heaven forbid the island is struck by a system.
Yeah, I think that's something that keeps many of us up at night. I know Prime Minister has said many times that this is the kind of stuff that keeps her up at night. And if it keeps her up at night, then we're responsible for making sure we correct it. So the BNOCL in particular has taken the responsibility among the group for working along with the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Department for Emergency Management to rationalize what we need to have on island at any given time in terms of emergency supplies. So that's a partnership that exists as it stands now, and a plan has been developed to ensure that we are able to have adequate supplies on island in the event of a disaster, that there is a backup plan that allows for us to have resources offshore, not offshore in terms of the ocean, but storage facilities in a neighboring island in the event of, so that we have less than 24-hour time in which we can get supplies shipped to Barbados for the purpose of resuming normal activity. Part of the collaboration is with the Barbados Light and Power Company, of course, to make sure that installations are where they need to be, that we have generation capacity. All of those things are well in place, and all of our agencies under energy are well prepared at this stage for the 2023 hurricane season. God forbid something actually hits us, we should be in a position to respond in the shortest possible time frame.
You mentioned storing supplies offshore.
Yeah.
Let's talk about offshore drilling.
It's a funny thing, you know, because Lisa, I was a young Foreign Service officer many moons ago when at the time these offshore oil blocks were discovered. One, that the maritime delimitation process was completed, and we started to talk about Barbados potentially being an offshore jurisdiction for oil. And it was exciting to many of us at the time. But this is why I think one of the things I've learned, certainly as a professional, is that what applied at one point in time can change so rapidly at another point in time. And so circumstances will change. And certainly as it relates to these offshore blocks, circumstances have changed. A Barbados who is on the front line of the climate crisis, a Barbados who is talking about a fossil fuel free future, a Barbados that is on the front line of leadership as it relates to onboarding renewable energy resources, is not a Barbados who equally is going to commence for the first time offshore oil drilling. And that is the reason why a Barbados who has a prime minister who has been the face of much of that advocacy has said, certainly in Parliament in March of this year when she delivered the budgetary statements and proposals, that it is our ambition as a government that even if we were to go into the offshore space, that we are not going for oil. Barbados will not be that nation that begins in 2023 or further down the line offshore drilling in our offshore blocks, and there are 26 of them, for oil, but we will in fact go only for natural gas. And that's going to be a pioneering position for countries to take, because except for countries that have proven offshore oil deposits, most countries and most companies who are majors in the oil space, they go for oil and gas. Barbados has taken a philosophical position on this, as we have with everything else relating to energy and climate. We are going only for natural gas. And that is the expectation of when we launch the bid round a little later on this year. It is a reason why we delayed from launching it as it would have been done in November, because times changed. Our philosophy has evolved, and Barbados's posture has evolved. And so Prime Minister also made the point, and we have been saying it to all of the partners who have been contacting us, it's there now, offshore. We're not getting anything from it offshore. But what we can do is to make sure that if there are partners out there who share the Barbados philosophy, who believe in sustainability, who understand that we are on the front line of the climate crisis and that significant efforts need to be made in order to ensure our development in a sustainable way while transitioning to renewable energy, and they're willing to pay Barbados not for extracting it, but for leaving it in the ground in the interest of preserving the planet, then we're open to having that happen to us too.
We've been talking for some time now about the build out of the energy sector. However, do we have the skill set locally to support this sector?
Oh, Lisa, what a question to ask me. I am really happy about that question because, you know, in my most recent incarnation before joining Cabinet full-time in 2020, I worked in the University of the West Indies, and I headed the commercial arm of the University of the West Indies. And so UWI is still very much always in my heart because they were really good to me in terms of my own intellectual development, both as a student and then as an employee. And so earlier this year, in fact, let me take a step back from there. Whenever we talk about new sectors, whenever we talk about new industries, whenever we talk about future development, Barbados has always been that country that has used the platform of a knowledge-based economy to drive those things forward. So I remember as a young student, as a young professional in the Foreign Service at the time, we were just beginning to negotiate trade agreements with Europe. It was the Economic Partnership Agreement at the time leading up to 2008. And through the OAS and the EU and other partners, we knew we needed the skills to take us into this new realm of reciprocal trade agreements. And we trained a range of professionals to be able to be upskilled to function in that new realm. I was one of the beneficiaries of that process. So I always pay attention to what it means to create new skills for development, new skills for new sectoral transformations. And energy is very much that. So I'm really excited to be leading this process. In January of this year, then I went to Scotland on mission, and I met with a range of persons, but one of the things that fascinated me most was an engagement with Robert Gordon University out of Aberdeen. We went out to Aberdeen for the day, and they showed me a modeling that I can see in front of me, and it was one of the most exciting things I had seen intellectually in a long time as a professional. They had modeled, we talk about our energy mix. So the Barbados energy mix is solar, wind, onshore, offshore, biogas. Now we're looking to include hydrogen storage. They knew what their energy mix was, lots of offshore, some onshore wind. And they then started to model what their skills were in country, what skills they already were producing in their education sector, where they intended to go by their 2050 target, because that was a time frame that they have set their targets for. And then by 2050, what skills they would need to be able to service the economy in the energy sector. And so they modeled, and they were able to rationalize what needed to be developed at the secondary level and at the tertiary level. We are now partnering with them to have that body of work done for Barbados, because I am 100% certain that we will not have everything that we need down the way, and we don't want to import labor. We want to be able to be a net exporter of labor, where we are not only having persons to service our domestic economy, but that countries from across the region and beyond the region are coming to Barbados for training in the skills that are going to be needed to service a transformation in their energy sector. And so in my mind, what I can see is a modeling being done here in Barbados on what we need, and that then leading to the establishment of a dedicated energy transformation institute here in Barbados, in partnership, I believe, with the University of the West Indies and other partners like Robert Gordon University and potentially others, that allows Barbados to upskill, retrain and transform its labor force for a new energy sector of the future, but simultaneously allows us to position ourselves as the net exporting country of energy skills globally, where countries from wherever they are, as they rationalize their own transformations, are coming here to Barbados as educational visitors to the country for 9 months, 3 years, to be able to take advantage of this leadership that Barbados has now developed globally on these critical issues. It's not just about what we do, it is the philosophy that drives what we do. And Barbados's philosophy, I believe, positions us ideally to be that hub for education center training here in Barbados, using an energy sector that I would want us to develop here in Barbados as a world-class institute. That's what I see.
Minister, with regards to wind energy, we have one commercial wind energy farm over at Guinea in St. John. Is there more interest in this source of energy?
At this point, yes. We are presently in discussions with one of our international financial organization partners to develop a 30 megawatt plant at Lambert's in St. Lucie. I was interested to see someone saying recently that it had not been taken forward. It was in a graveyard. And that's far from true. The IFC team was here just last week working on that wind project, 30 megawatts onshore wind at Lambert's in St. Lucie.
Like I said at the beginning of the program, energy has taken up the bulk of the program, but we want to jump quickly now over to the international business sector, which still runs second to tourism in terms of its contribution to foreign reserves. How is the international business sector performing post-COVID?
During COVID, post-COVID, the international business sector has been strong. Certainly our corporate receipts have been strong. I think right now at this stage where we are is where we are with every other sector, certainly in my ministry and across the government. Where do we need to go next? Where does Barbados need to go next? Where does the sector need to be positioned? And so that's the work that we're doing now. So we now have a new partnership with the OECD. Interestingly, we used to only see the OECD as the bad guy, but they're now partnering with the Global Forum, OECD. We met with them in Spain last year in November, and they have now offered us a 2-year technical assistance program that takes Barbados up to 2025, that allows us to transform the way in which we are engaging with this important agency. So we're now on the other side, the local side, also rationalizing what's the strategy for Barbados? What is the message for Barbados? What are we saying to the international community about Barbados as an international business, or rather a global business jurisdiction? That's what we're working on now. We hope to have that completed by the end of the year. We actually had an industry consultation earlier in the week on Monday with many of the partners, and you will see more of that coming out over the course of the coming months.
So since you're working so closely with the OECD, should Barbados then stay off of these blacklist, gray lists?
It's a lot of work that needs to be done. So, for example, in the area that we're working with the OECD now, we had in September last year and then in October last year, we had a range of areas where they were assessing Barbados, partially compliant, largely compliant, compliant. What we're doing now is being proactive, not putting ourselves in a position where we're on the back foot. So where we're compliant, we have to make sure we remain compliant. Where we are largely compliant, we have to make sure we transition that to compliant. Where we are partially compliant, we also have to get that to a minimum as largely compliant, but also fully compliant, so that Barbados is not constantly on a reactive scale of having to deal with these issues. The OECD isn't a blacklisting agency, but it would be their recommendations on which the EU and others would act that would cause Barbados to be blacklisted. We're trying, wherever possible, to stay in front of it.
And business facilitation within the sector is still a complaint?
It's still a complaint. It's a challenge that we actually are committed to wrestling to the ground. I now am meeting with the CAIPO team on a regular basis. We have a standing weekly meeting. We don't always get to have it based on other commitments, but within the shortest possible time frame, I expect that you'll be hearing something more about the work that is now to be done with CAIPO in terms of our overall business facilitation in the country, the work being done by IBU. Half of the issue sometimes is resources and making sure that they're adequately resourced to be able to deliver on the services that people expect. And we can't talk about the OECD and the EU and global business when we're not necessarily functioning at the best and optimum capacity. That's where we're committed to going.
Another one of your commitments is the area of trade. Quickly, tell us what is happening.
So the business community, we have fund access underneath us. We have trust loans. We're now in the process of rationalizing new products for trust loans, and also the rationalization of the fund access program, how that can be recapitalized to be able to make more capital available to the business community. But the principal thing that we want to be able to do is to launch a program which we have started to roll out called Scale Up Barbados. We are seeing small businesses in some instances remain small. We're seeing medium-sized businesses remain medium. We want to be able to get Barbadian businesses to scale up. If you're small, we want to be able to see Barbadian businesses come to large enterprises. We want to be able to get Barbadian businesses out into the regional space as franchised businesses. And so from this ministry, we are now building up a scaled up pipeline that leads over to entities like Export Barbados and to foreign trade, where you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade negotiating market access for us. So the groundwork starts with us, and that's what we're working through now. So it's a structural and a systemic and a whole of system transformation that we're working through right now.
Well, Minister, we know that energy took up the majority of the discussion. However, overall, what is your vision for your ministry?
I don't even know if we have enough time to talk about the vision for the ministry as a whole, because it has so many constituent parts. But ultimately, I think that Barbados is in that moment where Prime Minister has been speaking about, and we as a government have been speaking about, mission critical initially, mission survival initially, and now all of us are in mission transformation. For me, I need to be able to transform our energy space into the renewable energy space that is envisioned for 2030 and beyond. I need to be able to transform our business climate and business facilitation into what Barbados now needs to be and how we can position ourselves in an international community. I need to be able to position the skills and the services that are necessary to drive that economy forward. And so that is really going to be the substance of our work. That huge transformation agenda that helps to drive business, and with business, people and livelihoods transformation.
Minister, thank you so much for your time this evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
You're most welcome. That was the Minister of Energy and Business Development, Senator the Honorable Lisa Cummins. I'm Lisa Lord. You are watching One on One. Do have yourself a wonderful evening.